Hello, everyone. I think we're going to go ahead and get started. So my name is Siobhan Mears. I use he, him pronouns. I'm the Senior Director of Advocacy and Community Engagement here at the Center. First, I just want to thank you all for being here today. I recognize a lot of familiar faces. It's an honor to be with you all to have this conversation. I want to start by just thanking the New Pride Agenda and Equality New York for their partnership. It's been great working alongside both of these organizations in service of our community. We have a joint statewide platform. So we have a collaboration that really speaks to the momentum that we're trying to build as a community, working together to advance critical legislation on behalf of our community. Behind me, you'll see a number of different legislative priorities that we're focusing on for this year. For those of you that might not be as familiar, the Center does this work as part of a statewide advocacy initiative called Rights Out. It's a broad group of more than 50 LGBTQ and allied organizations working to advance equity and justice on behalf of our community. And it's exciting to see change taking effect and us building momentum in this way. Behind me, you'll see a number of legislative priorities in addition to 2 funding priorities that we are focusing on for 2022. So we know that all across New York State, LGBTQ people are facing unique challenges, whether that be physical or mental health disparities, a lack of access to affirming medical care, or social isolation or economic instability. We also know that the COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated many of these issues, and that community organizations remain on the front lines of providing critical services for our community. So I look forward to meeting and working with all of the folks that can help keep this momentum going. We have a lot to get done this year, but I'm confident that we can do that. This town hall is focused on the last bullet, so number 6, the TGNC Wellness and Equity Fund. So I'm excited to dive into a conversation to explain a little bit more about the opportunity that exists there. And I'm excited to also hear from our speakers today to share a little bit more. At this time, I want to welcome Elisa Crespo, who is the Executive Director of the New Pride Agenda, who will kick off the conversation and we'll dive a little bit more into our last budget ask. Thank you.
Thank you. Again, everyone, for coming. I know it's the middle of the day on a weekday and some folks are working, but I really appreciate those who came in person and those who are tuned in on Instagram Live. Thank you to Vaughn for those opening remarks. Thank you to the Center for providing us the space. And most of all, thank you to all of you who showed up, the advocates, the panelists, my team. We have some pretty amazing people here who joined us both from the city and state levels. We have Chanel Lopez from the governor's office, who's here, Deputy Director of LGBTQ Affairs. And we have her successor in the city level at the New York City Commission of Human Rights, Tabitha Gonzalez. Thank you for joining us. So we're here to talk about the Trans Wellness and Equity Fund. If you've been following the New Pride Agenda on social media, if you're on our email list, then you know that we have put together a statewide coalition of TGNC people, and we've been pushing really, really hard, many of them are in the room, to get a line item in this year's budget that is dedicated exclusively to trans-serving organizations, to the health and wellness of the trans and gender nonconforming community here in the state of New York. I'm going to talk a little bit about that, and then I'm going to introduce the panelists, and we'll jump right into it. It's going to be short and sweet. We're going to wrap up at about 1:45, 1:50. And Key is going to help me with the next slide. So we're one community. Why trans equity, right? All of us know that there is traditionally been money in the budget that is dedicated to the LGBTQ community at large. Every year it finds its way into the executive budget. It's known colloquially as the LGBTQ Health and Human Services budget. It historically has been $5 million for many, many years. And this year, we have reason to believe that it will increase to $12 million, which is historic and which we are proud of and which the new Pride agenda has been pushing for alongside Equality New York and the Center and many of the organizations that are a part of the network. So we're really proud of that. However, I think over the last few years, we all understand the fact that the needs of the gender expansive community, the needs of those of us who identify as transgender or gender nonconforming or non-binary or intersex are very different from our lesbian and gay brethren. And it's not about being divisive or competitive, it's just a fact. We have more needs, we have more expensive needs, we have more grim statistics. 37% by the last numbers that I could find of trans people in the state of New York were unemployed. 18% were living in poverty. We know that 1 out of every 2 Black trans women suffers from incarceration at some point in their life. We know that when you talk about suicidality, it's a hard word for me. When you talk about food insecurity, when you talk about homelessness, it's historically always been trans people of color who bore the brunt of that. And so this is an opportunity to do something about that. Key word is equity, and it's not unprecedented. This has been done in the state of California. Last year, Governor Gavin Newsom funded a trans wellness and equity fund in California to the tune of $13 million. And we here, the home of Stonewall, where the rebellion and the riot was led by trans people of color, we don't have this, and we should, and that's part of the reason why we're here today. As Marcia said very famously, no pride for all of us without liberation. No pride for some of us without liberation for all of us. That's exactly what we're trying to accomplish here with the Trans Wellness and Equity Fund. Key, if you'll take me to the next one, please. I want to take a sobering moment to talk about an icon in this community, Lorena Borjas. Today is her 2nd year anniversary of her passing. And when this fund becomes a reality through legislation that has been introduced by Assemblywoman Catalina Cruz and will be supported by State Senator Brad Hoylman, when that gets introduced, the fund will be named after Lorena Borjas in her honor. And we will hopefully be joined by her daughter, Liam Winslet, who carried on her legacy and who is leading the organization Trans Colectivo, which Lorena left when she unfortunately left us due to COVID complications. Lorena was a Mexican-American transgender and immigrant rights activist known as the mother of the transgender Latinx community in Queens. I think we all know and love and honor Lorena Borjas. And so I want to take a couple of seconds to have a moment of silence as we are honoring her 2nd anniversary of her passing. Thank you. Key, if you'll take me to the next slide, please. So a little bit of history, because the history matters, right? In 2002, 20 years ago, the state passed a law called the Sexual Orientation Non-Discrimination Act, known as SONDA. And what that did was it put into law protection, anti-discrimination protections based on sexual orientation. And at that time, there was a lot of debate about whether we should include gender identity and expression, whether those should be protected as well in the state of New York, and ultimately, that was not included in the legislation. Some of you may recall Sylvia Rivera being in her deathbed, pleading and fighting with folks to make sure that trans people were put into the Sexual Orientation Non-Discrimination Act, and that we had protections against discrimination too. That unfortunately didn't happen, and the bill was passed only protecting people on the basis of their sexual orientation. The next big thing that happened after that was marriage equality in 2011. New York was one of the first states to pass same-sex marriage, and that was historic in and of itself. But I think you all would agree with me that same-sex marriage does nothing to provide economic justice and equity for gender-expansive people anywhere. Beyond that, we had in gender, finally 17 years later, after the Sexual Orientation Non-Discrimination Act was passed, gender was passed, which is the Gender Expression Non-Discrimination Act, which finally added gender identity and expression to the state's human rights law. I do want to remind folks that a year after gender was passed, pay no mind to that, a year after gender was passed, we were hit with a global pandemic that devastated communities of color who were already suffering before the pandemic. So we here in New York have had protections, trans people I should say, have had protections on the book for about 2 years, but we haven't been able to realize our full potential because of the global pandemic that hit us right after passing this law. And so, having said that, we are now in 2022 and we're fighting for equity. We're fighting for funding in the budget that we, our community, trans people, gender expansive people, don't have to compete with behemoth organizations which we cannot compare. We don't have the organizing power, and it is what it is. Our numbers are smaller, and we shouldn't be conflating the needs of everyone in the LGBTQ community together as one. That just doesn't work. That doesn't improve our quality of life. So, Key, if you'll take me to the next one, please. Towards equity, you could take me to the next one. The Center and Equality New York and the New Pride Agenda collectively have put together a petition. And we'll be asking you all here to sign on to that petition if you haven't already. But more than 1,400 LGBTQ New Yorkers have signed that petition, which includes the entire platform that Trevon shared at the beginning of the presentation. And one of those things is, of course, the Trans Wellness and Equity Fund. So I just wanted to call attention to that. Is there another slide, Key, after that? Or is that the last one?
Just a petition.
So if you all don't mind taking out your phone and taking a screenshot of this, maybe saving it, if we could keep it up on the screen, that is.
We also have flyers that we can pass out.
Thank you so much, Vladimir, for passing out the flyers with the QR code. If you could take a picture right now, if you're not a panelist, because I'm about to call you up, and fill that out and sign our petition so that we can increase those numbers and bring them to the state, to Albany, and show them that this is a real grassroots people-powered movement. And with that, I'm going to introduce our panelists who showed up today. Thank you so much. First, I want to introduce, I'm going to say right here or now. I'm going to introduce first and foremost my friend, my colleague, my brother from the Bronx, the executive director, the founder of Destination Tomorrow, the Bronx LGBTQ Center. Please put your hands together for Sean Coleman. That was just excited about.
Okay.
And then, of course, I want to introduce our second panelist, the incomparable, the amazing, the founder of Trans Media, journalist, and member of the board of directors of the New Pride Agenda, the one and only Amara Jones. Jazzy, can you get me the paper of the rubber show, please? I think it's in my purse. So I have more questions to ask our panelists. Oh, I got it, Jazzy. Thank you. All right, so we're going to get right into it. Thank you, Sean and Amara, for joining us today. Thank you for those who are tuned in on Instagram Live. So the opening question, I'm going to kick it to Sean first. What are the differences between equality and equity to give folks insight about why we, as a broader social justice movement, need to prioritize equity beyond equality in this particular moment in history?
First and foremost, thanks for having me. Appreciate it. I think let's use this analogy. Equality means I want everybody to have, right? Equity is recognizing that everybody doesn't start from the same space. So making sure everybody has still doesn't give others a fair opportunity to succeed. So equity means I'm recognizing that some folks are starting in a different space, and I'm making accommodations for those folks that are starting in that space. That's the best way I can describe it.
That was perfect. Same question, Maura. What are the differences between equality and equity to give folks insight about why we as a broader social justice movement need to prioritize equity beyond equality in this particular moment?
So, since you were talking about money before, I'll make it about money. Equality is everyone gets a $300 stimulus check from the United States government, regardless of how much money they make. So everyone's gotten the same amount of money, regardless of whether or not you are a millionaire or whether or not you make $10,000 a year. That's equality. Everyone got the same thing. It's all fair, right? But we know that that's not fair because $300 means very different things depending on your economic background. What equity is something that's called, for instance, universal basic income, which says that we will make sure that no one in the United States, for example, makes less than $50,000 a year, in which case that means that people will get varying amounts of money depending on where they start. And that is the difference between equality and equity, that it makes sure, it guarantees a certain standard that no one will be allowed to fall behind and gets you out of the trap of the fairness that appears like equality and giving everyone the same, because we're not all the same and we don't have the same access, we haven't had the same opportunities, and so we need to build a just society that accommodates for that. That's the difference.
Beautiful answer. Thank you, Amara. Yeah, y'all can clap for that. So I'm going to kick it back over to you, Sean, for the next question. At a time when anti-trans violence and prejudicial policies are sweeping the nation and impacting trans and non-binary youth, why is it necessary for New York, one of the most progressive states or so-called progressive states in the nation, with strong LGBTQ protections, to take up the issues of trans equity?
Okay, a couple of things. First of all, I kind of want to push back about that progressive state, but I'm going to let that rock. I kind of want to push back on that progressive state, but we're going to let that rock for a minute. I think it's important because we're the birthplace of this LGBT rights movement, right? We've been successful in organizing around certain things, not necessarily things on trans things, but certain things. And I think we have the experience, right, to start a movement that can and will protect trans, especially trans youth. I think we get the opportunity. I think we get the opportunity. I don't know if mine is on there.
No.
It may not be. No. Okay. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? No? Yes?
There you go.
I think we get the opportunity to lead, right? And I think, especially when you look at organizing like around marriage equality and those kinds of things, we know that we have the infrastructure in place that we can take that model and kind of target whatever our issues or whatever things we're looking to address. So since the model is there, I don't understand why it wasn't a healthy shift from marriage equality to making sure that there was trans equity. But again, I said I wasn't going to be controversial when I came down. I'm saying that we have the correct tools that are in place already that seem like it would be an easy shift to go ahead and protect our trans siblings. But here's a larger point, right? If folks are experiencing injustice anywhere, none of us is safe. We also have to recognize that in this moment in time, if they're coming for black and brown trans youth, how much longer will it take for them to come for other folks that identify as marginalized, right? And then there are the intersections with reproductive rights and the woman's right to choose. All of these things are being attacked at one time. So if we can find the commonalities and use the blueprint that we have for marriage equality, I think we can put together a successful I think we can put together a successful campaign movement to continue to address these issues that are attacking trans folks.
Thank you, Sean. And you brought up something that we dance around, but I don't think that we should dance around it anymore. A few weeks ago, we had a huge rally because of the anti-choice, anti-LGBTQ appointments that the mayor had appointed. There were hundreds of people out there speaking against, in opposition to these appointments. Why? My answer, what I think, is because these individuals were anti same-sex marriage pastors and ministers. And much of the discourse in the media was around how these folks are marriage equality foes. No one talked about how these sorts of sentiments, these anti-LGBTQ sentiments, who they actually end up hurting in reality. And it's always Black and brown, trans and gender nonconforming people. And the reason that we saw those people come out is because they felt, and for that moment at least, whether or not it was realistic or feasible or not, that marriage equality was being attacked and at risk. We should have that, all of those people should be showing up in every public-facing event that has to do with trans equity.
But they're not here right now, right? And they should be. But if and when trans equity is passed, I guarantee you, every last one of those folks that didn't show up to help fight for it or support it will then put in an application or funding request or create some kind of trans whatever program so that they can get a bite of the apple. However, they've never shown up in moments like this. So if we're going to say it, let's say it.
Talk about it. Omar, the same question. At a time when anti-trans violence and prejudicial policies are sweeping the nation and impacting trans and non-binary youth, why is it necessary for New York, one of the most progressive states in the nation with strong LGBTQ protections, to take up the issue of trans equity? Omar's done a lot of work on what's happening around the country.
I mean, I think, I would ask for people to just look at an election map in New York. If you look at an election map of New York, you'll see that there are only two blue parts of the entire state. It's essentially all of New York City, Westchester, and Buffalo. Those are the blue parts of New York City, of New York State. And we have to remember that we have had a recent history of having had Republican and conservative, in quote, mayors of New York City. We have had conservative governors of New York State. And the reason why is because the state's not as progressive as you think it is. So that's the first important thing. So the protections are supposed to be there regardless of who is occupying the executive mansion, Grayson Mansion, or the executive mansion in New York State. So we need those protections because this state isn't as liberal as you think of it. And by the way, it's not all of New York City. It's 4 counties in New York City, not all. So first of all, just look at a map, and we are deceived by our perception of how progressive our state is, in part because the rest of the country is so conservative. So that's one thing. I also think that secondly, trans people have never been centered in anything in public policy. And it shows in the reality of our lives. It shows in extreme levels of violence. It shows in extreme levels of poverty, lack of healthcare access. And those are the result of choices that our governments have made about our relative value. And so the reason why we need those types of resources is that regardless of whether or not we live in a blue state, and I've already spoken to my skepticism about that, regardless of that, even in this progressive state of New York State, right, using that in quotes in case that's what you believe, there's never been an investment in trans people's lives, and it shows up in the extreme marginalization even in this state, right? so therefore we need trans equity in this state. And I mean, $12 million isn't even a down payment, right? But we need trans equity in every single way in order to rectify the historic nature that people are living out. It's no accident that trans people are marginalized. It's not an accident. It's not, it just didn't happen because, you know, that's just the way that history unfolded. No, there were lots of people have made lots of choices for a really long time in government, in business, in society that have led to this. And the only way that gets fixed is through a reversal of that marginalization and those decisions and those investments.
But it also speaks to the way we've aligned ourselves, right? Because in some ways, we are a part of some folks that will drop us by the wayside at will, right? They don't really see trans folks with having a lot of political power. So while the lesbians and the gays, they ignore bisexuals too. So while the lesbians and gays have successfully organized politically to get what they want, whenever there's a bargaining chip, it always seems like it's us. Like, okay, well, you take this because we don't quite understand them either, and give us what we asked for. And then they'll come back to the table and say, no, we didn't forget you. We were negotiating, so that's part of negotiation. Cool, we got to go back to the table. It's time for us to figure out what our leadership looks like, right? And politically, how we organize, and what our political power looks like for trans and gender non-conforming folks, and stop attaching ourselves to folks that could care less. I'm probably going to get in trouble for saying it, but that could care less about if we're moving progressively along with them. Because to your point, it hasn't happened by design. Cynthia was begging them to include us. That was 20 years ago. And the powers that be have still not included us in those spaces or discussions. So I think that has a lot to do with it too. We need to organize politically ourselves and come back to the table and say, this is what we bring to the table and we will not be ignored anymore. And it's the very folks that represent us that are ignoring us.
Can I just... Okay, I'm gonna get in trouble right now because I'm gonna have a slight disagreement with Shine. No. I'm gonna get in trouble.
Don't worry.
But no, what I would say is that I agree with 95% of what you said, but where you started, I actually disagree with. I think that like there is no modern LGBT, like gay and lesbian rights movement without trans people. It would not have existed. You know, the bottom line is that like, you know, basically white gays didn't show up to Stonewall until the last night, right? There were several nights before where it was still mostly black and brown trans people, and the first march organized by trans people, you know, and the first rally. And so all of that is the basis for modern political power. And so I think that the problem is that, like, just like everything else, you know, Sylvia and everybody else who was involved in that initial round of organizing, which led to this revolution here and around the world, were then deliberately excluded from the political movement that they created, right? And so like that again speaks to that. And in a modern sense, if we look at it in this idea of what you're talking about, Sean, in terms of like focusing and trying to organize ourselves, you know, what was, I guess 3 years this summer, you know, the largest rally in the history of the United States for trans rights happened in Brooklyn, and it was organized by Black trans people or trans people of color. So I just want to say that I do think that we have political power. I think that, to your point, sometimes that power is like railroad or marginalized after it gets momentum. But I do think we have power, and I don't want us to give that away. You know.
I would never give our power away, and I agree with all of what you just said, right? I think my larger point is that they have figured out a way to co-opt it. Yes, it started with us. We all know that fact. They a lot of them won't recognize it or won't allow us to tell that story. So yes, to everything you just said, but we have allowed them to co-opt those spaces. And to your point, well, I'm not going to talk about that because I really get myself in trouble. But I agree with you. And I'm saying, okay, so since we know that organizing is in our blood, and we set all of this off, how do we move it forward in a way that prioritizes the T and our needs? That's all I'm saying.
Totally.
Powerful discussion. If you're not following Trans Media and listening to the Trans podcast, please do so. Most of us in here are probably doing that, but Amara's speaking truth, and there's always something to learn on the podcast. So shout out to Trans Media. Let's talk numbers for a second. Nickels and dimes, actually. According to a 2018 report from Funders for LGBTQ Issues, only 4 cents of every $100 allocated to LGBTQ social justice issues are spent towards resourcing services for the trans community. So for every $100 given to LGBTQ causes, 4 cents goes to the trans community. $15 million is what we have been asking the state for. The $12 million that I was talking about was for a different fund that has existed for many years that is not going anywhere, which we're happy that they're getting that money, but we need separate money. The $15 million is a lot of money to me, and I'm sure to all of us, but if it were fully funded, the Trans Wellness and Equity Fund would only amount to 0.06% of the state's $216 billion budget. Right now, as we speak, members of the state legislature and the executive are negotiating $850 million in public funding for a football stadium in the governor's hometown. $850 million of your taxpayer dollars to subsidize a billionaire's football stadium is what we're up against. There are a number of things being negotiated in the state budget right now, which is supposed to come out on April 1st. We'll see if that actually happens. But I want to center that because the trans community is asking for $15 million, and we've got to fight for crumbs. But $850 million goes out to subsidize football stadiums in the snap of a finger. Something is wrong here, folks. One thing that trans folks know how to do is stretch a dollar, like $1 out of 50 cents. And so as people with directly impacted lived experience and community leaders and executive directors of trans-led and trans-serving organizations, what would $15 million mean to you, and how could your organization and the community at large tangibly benefit from this unprecedented funding, Sean?
I think 15 million is like a drop in the bucket. I see myself hiring additional staff. I see myself reimagining what housing and shelter looks like for trans and gender non-conforming folks. I see myself putting together a food pantry that almost looks like a grocery store where folks don't have to worry about how many bags they can get what they need. But I want to go back to your point about the 850 million. This is when I'm talking about power, right? I guarantee you that the lobbyists for the NFL, the Buffalo Bills, and all the other folks that find interest in getting this stadium built have been in the governor's ear for a very long time. That's power. That's them exercising their power and privilege to access the governor to get what they need. We don't have that kind of power. We don't have that kind of power that a lobbyist is going to go in on our behalf. We have you, and thank you, God, I appreciate you. But to have those lobbyists coming in to stay in the governor's ear and make that entire point that you just made, that doesn't exist. So when I'm speaking about the power and political power and being able to go into these rooms, those are the things that I'm talking about. And then I think we also have to figure out a way to make other folks recognize it. And we'd be remiss if we don't start talking about our allies, right? All of those folks that say that they're down with the community until it's not advantageous for them to be down with the community, or until we are putting our hands in a pot that they historically have dominated. So our allies also need to be a part of this discussion. They also need to be asking us, we have lobbyists, okay, so how can we utilize the spaces that we have so that we can get what you need done, or at the very least get you into the room so you can tell these folks what you need. Half the time you're not even in the room. That's not power. I have to go on a tangent.
Amara, if you would take a stab at the question,
question when you repeat it?
No. I mean, I think that, I agree with everything that Sean said, so there's no need to add. I think that the only thing that I would say is that the needs are so great, and for every single trans organization, large or small, and there's no limit to what additional resources can be. There's literally no limit.
So I'm gonna kick it to the next question. Before I get into the question, I just wanna say, I think this is important. One of the main objectives of what we're trying to do with the Trans Wellness and Equity Fund is make sure that the funds are distributed statewide. To make sure that funding is going to places that historically have not seen funding or don't have access to resources. So what we mean by that is outer boroughs, right? What we mean by that is Western New York, upstate. This state is more than just the city of New York, and half of our population is right here in the city, and we have a lot of resources, we're very fortunate, but there are suburban and rural parts of this state where trans people live and exist and have no access to resources. And so part of what we want to do is make sure that the funding is distributed equitably across demographics, but geographically as well. And a mission that we've always stood by when we were first putting this coalition together, we wanted to this money to be for trans-led organizations, period. We were told that's unconstitutional, you can't do that. The language can't say for trans-led organizations only. I don't know how true that is, but that's what we were told. So we find ourselves trying to come up with creative language, trans-serving, but what has always been a goal is to foster new and emerging trans leadership, to support the young people that are coming up with creative, innovative solutions to protecting trans people. I mean, you have organizations doing way more for the trans community than the state does, frankly. And that's just the truth. You have trans-led organizations figuring out how to provide people with money for rent, how to pay for gender-affirming care, how to provide housing. Destination Toronto has a housing program. This is the kind of leadership that we need to resource. We don't need people to take care of us. We know how to take care of ourselves. We just need to be invested in. And so with that said, the next question is, how can we all foster and empower the leadership of the next generation of trans youth who are needing support and looking to us for inspiration?
Paying for professional development, leadership workshops. We say we want to invest in them, but that's time and money. So what kinds of programs are we putting together? And to your point, we want the fund to touch folks where historically there has not been funding. But that also may mean that the trans leadership there is gonna need some advice and capacity building and technical assistance to get their non-for-profit or their program or whatever it is up to par, so that they can begin to provide services for the larger community. That's the kind of investment that we're gonna need, not just for our young people, but for our seasoned trans advocates and leaders as well. Money management, grant writing, budgeting, fundraising, fiscal responsibility, all of those things are the things that we should be coming back to and reinvesting with this fund. It would be amazing if we put together a workforce, not just for the trans community, but for the trans leadership as well, so that we can continue to sustain ourselves. Because what oftentimes happens is they'll give us money, they won't give us the resources, they don't give us the knowledge, they don't share the networks, they don't do any of those things, and then it fails, or we can't sustain itself. And then they say, oh, well, we gave you guys money, so what we're gonna do next is we're just gonna give it to the seasoned professionals, and they'll take care of you. They set us up for failure, and since we know that, we have to now begin to put those components in place to make sure that anyone that touches any of that trans equity money is successful, because we've given them the tools they need to be successful.
Same question, Amara.
I think that all of that is right. I would also say that fundamentally we have to make schools safe for trans people. Like, if we really want to make a difference in the lives of trans youth, schools have to fundamentally be safe. Because when you look at where kind of marginalization starts for trans youth, it often starts in schools. That is to say that schools are unsafe, they become places of violence. Consequently, it can impact the academic performance of trans students, or people drop out because schools are literally not safe. And that then impacts people for the rest of their lives, to where people have to try to go back and do GEDs later, or do all these extraordinary things to make up for the lost time because schools weren't safe. So we need to make schools safe for trans youth. We need to make them places where trans youth can thrive and learn and have access to resources and all the additional support that Sean is talking about. So we need to make schools safe for trans youth.
And shout out to Glisten, who's doing that work.
Yes.
So the next question is going to be the final question.
And schools aren't safe for trans kids, even in New York City. Schools
Oh
aren't
yeah,
safe.
they are not safe. We definitely have to do more work in that regard. We have to pass legislation that enforces or mandates, I should say, LGBTQ inclusive curriculum, so that young people can learn about Sylvia and Marcia and Harvey Milk and Audre Lorde, and not have to grow up in this world thinking that people who are different, people who are queer, have not contributed to society, because we have. We need young allies to know that we've contributed to this world historically. All of that is very important, and that's another thing on our agenda, but right now we're focused on coins and money. So the last question is, as we move beyond a movement culture of equality towards achieving equity, if you take nothing from today, take the word equity home with you. For those of us who are still marginalized, what's next? What issues do we need to center more in our advocacy, our organizing, and our policy making?
First, the housing, right? The shelter system, the housing system, the market in New York City, it's not sustainable for anybody. I don't know too many folks that with one job that can maintain safe, affordable housing. So I think housing has to be the first thing. And I think when we begin to have discussions with our allies, I think they should be able to see where these intersections are, right? So there's nothing that we're going to say that doesn't impact cisgender folks as well. Housing, food insecurity, safety, reproductive rights, revamping the criminal justice system. Like, all of these things are community issues. What we need to do is address those other nuances around how it impacts those who identify as trans and gender nonconforming. But when you look at the root of it, these are all community issues that we should be able to go into any community board meeting, any police accountability meeting, civilian, whatever they call those folks. We should be able to go into any of these meetings and be able to sit at the table as an open trans person and say, but this is how it impacts my community, and these are the things that I think we need to do to put in place in order to make it more safe, more accessible, more reliable, more whatever for us. I'm going to keep going on tangents because I get upset about this stuff. But I just feel like community already knows this, right? The folks that have been doing the work the longest, we've been having these discussions forever and still wait for folks to show up for us. And I think it gets frustrating after a while, because how many times do you have to say, we want you to have, we want equity, and we know you know what equity means. We don't have to give you the Webster's version of what equity means. You know what it means. You know, if you're sitting in a room and they're passing out $500,000 and we all get $100,000, and you got a budget that's $15 million and I got $100,000, that's my budget. You know that's not equitable. So when are we going to, like, it's just become so frustrating to constantly have to have this conversation.
Thank you, Sean. I want to take a stab at this question. What issues do we need to center more in our advocacy, organizing, and policy making? There are, as we know of, about 120,000 trans people on record in the state of New York. I think there are way more than that. This is just what we know of on paper. For me, a dream of mine would be to find all 100,000 plus trans people and find out if they're civically engaged, if they're registered, if they're able and eligible to vote, and to really start that organizing power, that political organizing power that folks in power respond to, frankly. There's not a lot of trans people that enjoy doing political work, and I get it, right? This is a place where historically space hasn't been made for us. We don't feel comfortable in rooms, in political spaces. There's so much trauma and violence that goes on that it's understandable that folks just don't even want to deal with this system. Like, I totally get that. There's people have no faith in it, and not just trans people, but young people of color in general. If you go to the Bronx, in Central Bronx where I live, young people who are eligible to vote from 18 to 21 are just uninspired, don't feel like their vote even matters. And that's dangerous, because that's exactly how they want us to feel and think. The reason I'm so passionate about this work is because I know that there are decisions about trans people being made in rooms where there are no trans people present. And that has to stop. They need to know that we're here, that we're listening, that we understand what's going on, and that our voices are free and loud and strong. And so that's part of the reason why I do this kind of work. So civic engagement, I think, is so important in the trans community. Thank you, Tabitha. We're going to wrap this up with one last question, and you might have spoken about this in your previous question, but what issues do we need to center more in our advocacy, our organizing, our policy making?
I agree with everything that you all said. I would add to that, I wrote a piece about this a couple of years ago, that I really think that it's fundamentally economic opportunity. That when you look at violence and trans people who stay alive and who don't stay alive, when you look at who's able to thrive and who's not able to thrive, once you start to look at who's able to have economic opportunity, it becomes very clear, right? It's the clearest thing of whether or not trans people thrive or not. It is what type of jobs they have and whether or not they're able to hold those jobs over a long period of time. Because one of the things that happens is that even for people who have jobs, 1 out of 3 trans people ends up changing their job every year because of on-the-job harassment and violence, right? So if that happens, you're not getting promoted, you're not getting, salary increases. There are all these things that you can't do in your life if you have to change jobs all the time, not because you don't like it or not because you're competent, but because people target you on your job because you're trans. So I think that we have to get really radical about economic opportunity for trans people. I really think that we ought to think about affirmative action for trans people. I really think that we ought to think about UBI for trans people. That's universal basic income, where we say anyone who's trans, we're going to guarantee that they don't make any less than $50,000 a year. So if you end up having to be in a job where you make $15,000 that year, there's a $35,000 income transfer for you. I think that we have to if we're gonna correct the economic opportunity of trans people, I think we have to be really radical and really bold, because even just doing like more marginal things that the government's used to doing is not gonna correct the problem.
And thank you for centering that economic justice, because that's fundamentally why we're sitting here in this room. A trans wellness and equity fund can achieve all of those things. There's no reason why it can't, right? It could be used for universal basic income. It could be used for housing subsidies. It could be used for mental health services, legal services, for job training. It could be used for so many things. It is not just about health. It's about labor. It's about housing. It's about so many things. And right now what we're fighting for is money in the budget, but we will pass legislation that will be broader and expansive and that will have these details hashed out in the language of the bill, and we will champion it. But what we don't want to do is what sometimes happens is pass a bill that creates a fund with no money in it. So we need the appropriation now in this year's budget by the April 1st deadline. And with that, I want to, it's not lost on me that I'm sitting between two powerhouses, between Sean Coleman and Amara Jones, and I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for showing up today. @TGN/media. Sean Coleman at Destination Tomorrow, plug in your
That's tomorrow, 452,
452.
and I'm Boss Breed.
Boss Breed.
Boss Breed,
Okay,
305.
That's his personal.
I had to hear it twice. Yeah.
And of course, you can follow New Pride Agenda at New Pride Agenda. Please fill out the survey. Please call even if you don't want to fill out the petition, call up your local representative. Tell them, have you heard about the Trans Wellness and Equity Fund? What are you doing to fight for it in this budget? Send an email, send a text. Do what you can. Your voice is powerful and it matters.